The conference room fell silent as Daniel Hartwick tossed Irene Hill's resume across the mahogany table, barely suppressing his laughter. "You're telling me this is your top candidate?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "A 26-year-old with a degree from some university I've never heard of and zero field experience? For a Pentagon cybersecurity contract?" Irene sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She'd heard this before. The dismissal. The mockery. The assumption that her quiet demeanor and unconventional background meant she couldn't possibly be what they needed. What Daniel didn't know was that in 48 hours, his phone would ring with a call that would make him question everything he thought he knew about capability, expertise, and the catastrophic cost of judging people by their resumes instead of their results. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. Irene Hill had always been an anomaly. Born in a small coastal town in Croatia, she grew up in a household where technology was treated with suspicion and higher education was considered a luxury rather than a necessity. Her parents ran a modest fishing supply shop, and the expectation was that Irene would eventually take over the family business, marry someone local, and live the same predictable life that generations before her had lived. But Irene had other plans. From the age of 12, she'd been fascinated by computers, teaching herself programming languages using borrowed library books and whatever free internet access she could find at the local community center. While her classmates were focused on social dynamics and weekend parties, Irene was spending 18-hour days learning Python, Java, and eventually, the more obscure languages that powered cybersecurity systems. Her parents didn't understand. They saw her obsession as a phase, something she'd grow out of once she discovered boys or developed more practical interests. When she announced at 17 that she wanted to study computer science at university, her father had laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of dismissive affection that hurt more than outright mockery. "Computers are for men, Irene," he'd said, ruffling her hair like she was still a child. "You're too emotional for that kind of work. Too sensitive. You need something more suited to your temperament." Irene had proven him wrong by securing a full scholarship to the Technical University of Zagreb, one of the few institutions in Croatia with a respected computer science program. But even there, she faced the same assumptions. Her professors treated her contributions in class with polite skepticism. Her male classmates either ignored her entirely or made comments about how she must be sleeping with someone to maintain her grades. The truth was that Irene was brilliant. Not just competent, but genuinely exceptional in ways that traditional metrics struggled to capture. She could see patterns in code that others missed, could identify vulnerabilities in systems that had been certified secure by teams of experienced analysts. She had an intuitive understanding of how systems worked, not just mechanically but psychologically, understanding how human error and oversight created the gaps that hackers exploited. By the time she graduated, Irene had already started building a reputation in certain circles. Underground forums where security researchers shared information knew her by her handle, Nighthole47. She'd identified and reported 17 critical vulnerabilities in major software systems, earning bug bounties that had helped her pay for her education. But none of that translated into traditional credentials that companies valued. When she applied for positions at major tech firms across Europe, she received rejection after rejection. Her resume looked thin compared to candidates who had attended prestigious universities, who had internships at recognizable companies, who fit the profile of what a cybersecurity expert was supposed to look like. The few interviews she did secure inevitably ended the same way, with polite thanks and the clear sense that they'd already decided she wasn't what they were looking for before she'd even entered the room. Irene had almost given up on finding legitimate work in her field when she heard about Hartwick Defense Solutions, a mid-sized American contractor that specialized in cybersecurity for military and government clients. They were opening a European office and looking for analysts who could work on international projects. The job posting specifically mentioned that they valued unconventional backgrounds and fresh perspectives. It felt like the opportunity she'd been waiting for. Irene spent 3 weeks preparing her application, documenting not just her academic credentials but her real-world experience in identifying vulnerabilities, her understanding of emerging threats, her ability to think like both a defender and an attacker. She included references from respected figures in the security research community who could vouch for her capabilities. The initial response had been encouraging. The HR department seemed impressed by her portfolio, and they'd scheduled her for an interview at their newly established office in Vienna. Irene had flown in from Zagreb, spending money she couldn't really afford on professional clothes and a hotel room, determined to make the best possible impression. The interview was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm, the kind of day that made Vienna look like something from a postcard. Irene arrived 30 minutes early, sitting in the building's lobby and reviewing her notes, trying to calm the nervous energy that always preceded these moments. The receptionist called her name at exactly 2 p.m., and Irene followed her through a maze of corridors to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Inside, 3 people were waiting. The first was a woman in her 40s named Patricia Novak, who introduced herself as the Director of European Operations. The second was a younger man named Vincent Roth, who would be her direct supervisor if she got the position. And the third was Daniel Hartwick himself, the founder and CEO of Hartwick Defense Solutions. Irene shook hands with each of them, noting the way Hartwick's grip was perfunctory, his attention already drifting toward his phone before she'd even taken her seat. Patricia and Vincent seemed genuinely interested in her application, asking thoughtful questions about her background and her approach to security analysis. For the first 20 minutes, the interview went well. Then Hartwick looked up from his phone and actually read her resume for what appeared to be the first time. His expression shifted from disinterest to something approaching amusement. He picked up the document, holding it between 2 fingers as if it might contaminate him, and looked at Patricia with raised eyebrows. "You're telling me this is your top candidate?" he said, his tone making it clear he considered this a joke. "A 26-year-old with a degree from some university I've never heard of and zero field experience?" Patricia's expression tightened, but she maintained her professional composure. "Mr. Hartwick, if you look at the portfolio materials, you'll see that Miss Hill has extensive practical experience in vulnerability research in—" "I don't care about bug bounties and forum posts," Hartwick interrupted, tossing the resume across the table toward Irene. "I care about real credentials. Real experience. We're bidding on a Pentagon contract worth $40 million. You think I'm going to stake that on someone who learns cybersecurity from YouTube tutorials?" Irene felt heat rise in her cheeks, that familiar combination of shame and anger that she'd experienced so many times before. But she kept her voice steady when she responded. "With respect, Mr. Hartwick, I didn't learn from YouTube tutorials. I have a degree in computer science with a specialization in network security, and I've identified vulnerabilities in systems used by major corporations and government agencies. My lack of traditional field experience doesn't mean I lack capability." Hartwick leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Here's what I know about capability, Miss Hill. Real cybersecurity work isn't about finding bugs in software. It's about understanding how nation-states operate, how military systems are architected, how defense contractors protect classified information. It requires experience, maturity, and connections that you simply don't have. I understand the technical aspects of those systems better than most people with decades of experience," Irene replied, her accent becoming slightly more pronounced as emotion crept into her voice. "I've studied the architecture of military networks, I understand the threat landscape, and I know how to think like the adversaries who target these systems." Hartwick's smirk widened into something close to genuine laughter. "You think you understand military networks because you've read some white papers? Listen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this conversation is a waste of everyone's time. Patricia, Vincent, I don't know what you were thinking bringing her in here, but this interview is over." Patricia opened her mouth to protest, but Hartwick was already standing, buttoning his suit jacket with the dismissive air of someone who'd already moved on to more important matters. "Miss Hill, I'm sure you're very talented at whatever it is you do. But Hartwick Defense Solutions operates at a level that requires proven expertise. I suggest you get a few more years of experience under your belt before applying to positions like this." Irene remained seated, her hands still folded calmly in her lap even as her mind raced with 100 different responses she wanted to give. The professional ones about how his company's own website touted their commitment to diverse perspectives and unconventional thinking. The personal ones about how men like him had been underestimating her entire life. The technical ones that would demonstrate exactly how much she understood about the systems he claimed she couldn't possibly comprehend. Instead, she simply stood, gathering her materials with deliberate precision. "Thank you for your time," she said, her voice carrying no trace of the humiliation burning in her chest. She shook hands with Patricia and Vincent, both of whom looked genuinely apologetic, then walked out of the conference room with her head high and her expression neutral. It wasn't until she reached the building's lobby that she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Another rejection. Another dismissal based on assumptions rather than evidence. Another man who'd looked at her resume and decided that her background, her age, her gender, and probably her accent all added up to someone who couldn't possibly be what they needed. Irene found a bench in a small park near the office building and sat down, staring at the Vienna skyline without really seeing it. The sunny afternoon felt like a mockery now, beautiful weather for a day that had turned ugly. She thought about her parents back in Croatia, about how her father had warned her that this path would lead to disappointment. Part of her wanted to prove him wrong so badly it hurt. Another part wondered if he'd been right all along. Her phone buzzed with a message from Patricia Novak. "I'm so sorry about how that went. You deserved better. If there's anything I can do to help with other opportunities, please let me know." The kindness in the message somehow made it worse, confirmation that the interview had been as humiliating as it felt. Irene sat on that bench for nearly an hour, watching people pass by, couples enjoying the weather, tourists taking photos, professionals hurrying between meetings. All of them going about their lives while she tried to figure out what came next. The rejection itself wasn't new, but something about Hartwick's laughter, the casual cruelty of how he dismissed years of her work, had cut deeper than usual. Finally, she stood and began walking back toward her hotel. She had a flight back to Zagreb the next morning, and then she'd have to figure out her next move. Maybe she'd focus on freelance work, building up the kind of traditional experience that people like Hartwick respected. Maybe she'd try to get a position at a smaller company where her unconventional background would be seen as an asset rather than a liability. What Irene didn't know was that while she'd been sitting on that bench, something was happening 7,000 miles away that would completely change the trajectory of her life and Daniel Hartwick's company. In a secure facility outside Washington, D.C., a team of Pentagon cybersecurity analysts had just detected something that made their blood run cold. The classified military communication network known as STRATCOM-7, which handled coordination between NATO allies, had been compromised. Not just probed or tested, but actively penetrated by what appeared to be a sophisticated state-sponsored hacking group. The breach had been invisible to every automated security system, every intrusion detection protocol, every human analyst who'd been monitoring the network. It had been operating for at least 3 weeks, quietly exfiltrating classified information about troop movements, strategic planning, and alliance coordination. The potential damage was catastrophic, not just for U.S. national security but for the entire Western defense infrastructure. Within 2 hours of discovering the breach, every major defense contractor with Pentagon cybersecurity contracts received an emergency notification. Among them was Hartwick Defense Solutions, which had been one of the primary vendors responsible for securing portions of the STRATCOM-7 network. The notification was clear: all hands on deck, immediate response required, and if the source of the breach was traced to contractor negligence, there would be severe consequences including criminal prosecution. Daniel Hartwick received the call while he was having dinner at an expensive restaurant, celebrating what he thought had been a productive day. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel James Brennan, his primary Pentagon contact and the man responsible for approving Hartwick's contracts. "Daniel, we have a situation," Brennan said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "STRATCOM-7 has been compromised. The breach appears to have originated from a vulnerability in one of the authentication protocols your company certified as secure 6 months ago." Hartwick felt his stomach drop. "That's impossible. We ran comprehensive testing on those protocols. Triple-checked everything. Well, someone found a way through, Brennan replied. And if we can't identify and patch this vulnerability in the next 72 hours, you're looking at losing every Pentagon contract you have. Plus potential criminal liability for security negligence. Hartwick left the restaurant immediately, racing back to his office where his senior team was already assembling. The conference room, the same one where he'd laughed at Irene Hill's resume just hours earlier, was now filled with stressed analysts pulling up code, reviewing security protocols, and trying to understand how their supposedly impenetrable system had been compromised. For the next 18 hours, Hartwick's team worked frantically to identify the vulnerability. They brought in external consultants, contacted the software vendors who'd provided the underlying authentication system, and reviewed thousands of lines of code looking for the weakness that had been exploited. Nothing. The breach was so sophisticated, so carefully designed, that it was invisible to every conventional analysis method they tried. By Wednesday evening, Hartwick was facing the real possibility that his company was finished. The Pentagon had made it clear that if they couldn't identify and fix the vulnerability within the 72-hour window, they would terminate all existing contracts and potentially pursue legal action. Hartwick Defense Solutions would be blacklisted from government work, which represented 80% of their revenue. In desperation, Hartwick called Patricia Novak in Vienna. "I need every analyst we have looking at this," he told her. "I don't care if they're junior, senior, or still in training. Everyone who understands network security needs to be reviewing this breach." Patricia hesitated before responding. "Daniel, there might be one option you haven't considered. It's unconventional, but given the circumstances." "I don't care how unconventional it is," Hartwick interrupted. "What have you got?" "The candidate we interviewed yesterday. Irene Hill. She specializes in exactly this kind of vulnerability analysis. Her portfolio includes similar breaches that she identified when other analysts couldn't see them." Hartwick felt a flash of irritation. "Patricia, this is not the time for charity cases. We need proven experts, not enthusiastic amateurs." "She's not an amateur," Patricia replied firmly. "And you're running out of options. At least let me send her the sanitized version of the breach data. If she can't help, you've lost nothing. But if she can see something we're missing." Hartwick was quiet for a moment, weighing his pride against his survival instinct. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. Send it to her. But this stays completely confidential. The last thing I need is word getting out that we're so desperate we're consulting random applicants." Patricia ended the call and immediately contacted Irene, catching her just as she was packing for her flight back to Zagreb the next morning. "Miss Hill, I know this is unusual, but we have a situation that requires your specific expertise. Are you available for an urgent consultation?" Irene listened as Patricia explained the situation, carefully avoiding any classified details but making it clear that there was a critical security breach that Hartwick's entire team had been unable to solve. The request was remarkable in its desperation, and Irene recognized it for what it was, a last resort from people who had run out of options. She should have said no. Should have told Patricia that Daniel Hartwick had made his opinion of her capabilities abundantly clear. Should have let them fail and moved on with her life. Instead, she heard herself saying, "Send me whatever data you can share. I'll take a look tonight." The sanitized data arrived in Irene's email at 11:47 p.m. Vienna time. She sat in her modest hotel room, the city lights twinkling through her window as she opened the encrypted files on her laptop. The information was carefully redacted to remove classified details, but the technical fingerprint of the breach was clear enough for someone who knew what to look for. Irene began her analysis the way she always did, not by diving immediately into the code but by stepping back and thinking about the psychology behind the attack. Most security analysts focused exclusively on the technical aspects, looking for coding errors or configuration mistakes. But Irene had learned that the most sophisticated breaches exploited something more fundamental, human assumptions about how systems were supposed to work. She spent the first hour simply reading through the incident reports, noting the timestamps, the affected systems, and the patterns of data exfiltration. Something felt wrong about the way the breach was described. The attack was too clean, too perfectly aligned with how security teams would expect a state-sponsored intrusion to behave. It was almost as if the attackers wanted to be found eventually, but only after they'd accomplished their primary objective. By 2 a.m., Irene had identified something that Hartwick's team had completely missed. The breach wasn't coming from an external source at all. Or rather, it was, but only superficially. The real vulnerability was an insider threat vector, a piece of legacy code that had been deliberately left in place during a system upgrade 6 months earlier. The code created a backdoor that appeared to be part of the normal authentication process, making it invisible to conventional security scans. But here's what made it brilliant: the backdoor only activated when specific authentication attempts failed in a particular sequence. It was designed to look like random connection errors, the kind of minor glitches that happen in any large network. Unless you were specifically looking for this pattern, you'd never see it. And even if you did notice the pattern, you'd assume it was a bug rather than a deliberately engineered vulnerability. Irene's hands moved quickly across her keyboard as she documented her findings. She traced the code back to its origin point, identifying exactly when and how it had been introduced into the system. The timestamp corresponded with a routine maintenance update performed by one of Hartwick's own contractors, which meant that someone with inside access had deliberately planted this vulnerability. This wasn't just a security breach. It was sabotage, carefully planned and executed by someone who understood Hartwick's systems intimately. The implications were staggering. It meant that someone within Hartwick Defense Solutions, or one of their trusted partners, had deliberately compromised a military communication network. By 4 a.m., Irene had compiled a comprehensive report detailing the vulnerability, its origin, the method of exploitation, and a proposed fix. She included technical documentation that would allow Hartwick's team to verify her findings independently. She also included a recommendation that they immediately investigate their contractor vetting process, because this level of insider access suggested a serious counterintelligence problem. She attached the report to an email addressed to Patricia Novak, hesitated for just a moment, then clicked send. Part of her wondered if Hartwick would even bother to read it, given his opinion of her capabilities. Another part of her didn't care. She'd done what they asked, identified something their entire team had missed, and documented it thoroughly. What they did with that information was their problem now. Irene closed her laptop and tried to get a few hours of sleep before her morning flight. As she lay in the dark hotel room, she thought about Daniel Hartwick's laughter, the casual dismissal of her resume, the assumption that she couldn't possibly understand systems at this level. Tomorrow, he would discover exactly how wrong he'd been. The thought brought her a small, bitter satisfaction as sleep finally claimed her. Patricia Novak saw Irene's email at 6:15 a.m. Vienna time. She'd been awake all night coordinating with Hartwick's team in the United States, and the situation had only grown more desperate. Every hour that passed without identifying the vulnerability brought them closer to losing everything the company had built over 15 years. She opened Irene's report with low expectations, assuming it would be a well-meaning but ultimately useless analysis from someone who lacked the experience to understand the complexity of the problem. What she read instead made her sit up straight in her chair, her exhaustion forgotten. The analysis was brilliant. Not just competent, but genuinely exceptional in ways that demonstrated a level of understanding far beyond what Patricia had expected. Irene hadn't just identified the vulnerability, she'd reverse-engineered the entire attack methodology, traced it back to its source, and provided evidence that this was an insider threat operation. Patricia immediately forwarded the report to Hartwick with a message marked urgent. "Daniel, you need to read this immediately. The candidate you dismissed yesterday just solved your Pentagon problem. And it's worse than we thought." In Washington, Daniel Hartwick had been awake for 36 hours straight, surviving on coffee in the desperate hope that his team would somehow crack the problem before the Pentagon's deadline expired. He was in the middle of another fruitless conference call with his senior analysts when Patricia's email arrived. He almost ignored it, assuming it was just another routine update from the Vienna office. But something about Patricia's message made him open it. He began reading Irene's report, his skepticism evident in the way he skimmed the first few paragraphs. Then his reading slowed. His expression changed from dismissive to focused to something approaching alarm. "Gentlemen, I need to call you back," he said abruptly, ending the conference call without waiting for responses. He read through Irene's entire report twice, then immediately began pulling up the system logs she'd referenced. Everything she documented was verifiable, and the more he checked, the more he realized that she was absolutely right. The vulnerability wasn't just a technical oversight. It was deliberate sabotage, planted by someone with insider access during a routine maintenance update. Hartwick pulled up the records from that update and felt his blood run cold when he saw the name of the contractor who'd performed the work. Robert Chen, a trusted analyst who'd been with the company for 3 years and had security clearance for their most sensitive projects. Hartwick grabbed his phone and called Colonel Brennan at the Pentagon. "James, I've found the source of the breach. But you need to get counterintelligence involved immediately. This wasn't an external attack. It was an inside job." 20 minutes later, Hartwick's office was swarming with FBI agents specializing in counterintelligence operations. Robert Chen was taken into custody at his home in Maryland, and a forensic analysis of his communications revealed that he'd been recruited by a foreign intelligence service 18 months earlier. The Stratcom 7 breach was just one of several operations he'd been running. As the FBI agents worked, Hartwick sat in his office trying to process what had just happened. His entire team of experienced analysts, people with decades of combined experience and impressive credentials, had completely missed what a 26-year-old woman from Croatia had identified in a few hours of work. His phone rang. It was Colonel Brennan, and his tone was very different from the panic of the previous day. "Daniel, I just reviewed the analysis from your European consultant. This is extraordinary work. She didn't just find the vulnerability, she uncovered an active counterintelligence operation." "Who is this person?" Hartwick felt something uncomfortable twist in his stomach. "Her name is Irene Hill. She's a candidate we interviewed for an analyst position in our Vienna office." "Candidate? You mean she doesn't work for you yet?" Brennan's voice rose slightly. "Daniel, this woman just saved your company and possibly prevented a massive intelligence disaster. I want her to read into the full investigation immediately. And I want her on your team for the Pentagon contract debrief." Hartwick ended the call with Brennan and sat in silence for a moment, staring at Irene's report on his screen. The memory of yesterday's interview played back in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. His laughter. His dismissal of her resume. His certainty that she couldn't possibly understand military systems. Every word he'd spoken now felt like evidence of his own incompetence rather than hers. He picked up his phone and called Patricia Novak in Vienna. "Is Miss Hill still in the city?" "She was scheduled to fly back to Zagreb this morning," Patricia replied. "But I can try to reach her." "Do more than try. Find her. Offer her whatever it takes to get her on a flight to Washington today. The Pentagon wants her involved in the counterintelligence investigation, and I need her here for the contract debrief." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Daniel, you understand that after yesterday's interview, she has every reason to tell us to go to hell?" "I understand that perfectly," Hartwick replied, his voice tight. "Which is why you're going to make it clear that this isn't just an apology. It's a complete acknowledgement that I was wrong about everything. Her capabilities, her qualifications, her understanding of these systems. All of it." Patricia found Irene at the Vienna airport, sitting in a cafe near her departure gate. Irene looked up as Patricia approached, her expression carefully neutral. "Miss Novak. I didn't expect to see you here." "Miss Hill, I need you to cancel your flight," Patricia said, sitting down across from her. "The Pentagon has requested your presence in Washington for the counterintelligence investigation. Your analysis didn't just identify a technical vulnerability. You uncovered an active espionage operation." Irene took a sip of her coffee, processing this information. "I'm glad the report was helpful. But I'm not interested in working for Mr. Hartwick's company." "This isn't about working for the company," Patricia replied carefully. This is about the Pentagon specifically requesting your expertise on a matter of national security. They want you read into the full investigation. Colonel Brennan was very clear that your participation isn't optional, it's essential. And Mr. Hartwick? What does he think about the Pentagon insisting on help from someone with zero field experience? Irene's tone was polite, but the edge was unmistakable. Patricia met her eyes directly. Mr. Hartwick knows he was wrong. Completely, categorically wrong. About your capabilities, about what matters in this field, about everything he said in that interview. He asked me to convey that this isn't just an apology. It's an acknowledgement that you understand these systems better than anyone on his team. Irene was quiet for a moment, studying Patricia's face for any sign of insincerity. Finally, she asked, "If I agree to go to Washington, I want certain conditions made clear. I'm not interested in being patronized or having my contributions minimized. If I'm involved in this investigation, I'm involved as a full participant, not as someone's diversity hire or charity case." "Understood," Patricia replied. "And for what it's worth, Mr. Hartwick isn't the one driving this anymore. The Pentagon is. They've seen your work, and they want you on this investigation because you're the best person for it." Irene arrived in Washington 12 hours later, her canceled return ticket to Zagreb replaced by a business-class seat on a transatlantic flight. Patricia had arranged for a Pentagon security officer to meet her at Dulles International Airport and escort her directly to the secure facility where the investigation was headquartered. The officer, a no-nonsense woman named Lieutenant Weber, handed Irene a temporary security badge and a thick folder of non-disclosure agreements. "You'll be working in a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. Everything you see and hear inside is classified. No phones, no recording devices, no discussing anything outside the facility. Understood?" "Understood," Irene replied, signing the paperwork with steady hands. Part of her still couldn't quite believe this was happening. 48 hours ago, she'd been sitting in a Vienna park, convinced that her cybersecurity career was going nowhere. Now she was being escorted into a Pentagon investigation as a key technical consultant. The SCIF was located 3 levels below ground, accessed through multiple security checkpoints and biometric scanners. Inside, the space looked like a high-tech war room, with multiple screens displaying network diagrams, surveillance footage, and classified documents. A dozen people were already working, most in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes that marked them as intelligence analysts or FBI agents. Colonel Brennan stood at the center of the operation, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent his career making difficult decisions. He looked up as Irene entered, his expression shifting from focused intensity to something approaching relief. "Miss Hill, thank you for coming on such short notice," he said, extending his hand. "Your analysis has been invaluable to this investigation. I'm hoping you can help us understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Over the next 3 hours, Irene was briefed on everything the investigation had uncovered. Robert Chen, the insider who'd planted the vulnerability, had been providing classified information to a foreign intelligence service for 18 months. The Stratcom 7 breach was part of a larger operation targeting multiple NATO communication systems. Chen's arrest had disrupted the operation, but there were concerns about other compromised personnel and additional vulnerabilities that hadn't been discovered yet. "The problem we're facing," Brennan explained, "is that Chen had access to multiple systems across different contractors. We've identified the vulnerability in Stratcom 7, but we need to audit every system he touched to ensure there aren't similar backdoors elsewhere." Irene studied the network diagrams spread across the conference table. "That could take months with conventional auditing methods. But if I'm right about how he designed these backdoors, there should be a signature pattern we can scan for. Something that identifies his specific methodology. Can you develop that scan?" Brennan asked. "I can try," Irene replied. "But I'll need access to the full technical specifications for all the affected systems. Not the sanitized versions. The actual classified architecture." Brennan exchanged glances with the FBI agents in the room. Miss Hill, what you're asking for requires a level of security clearance that normally takes months to process. Then you'll be auditing systems manually for months, Irene replied calmly. Or you can expedite my clearance and potentially find these vulnerabilities in days instead of months. Your choice, Colonel. Colonel Brennan made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. He authorized an emergency security clearance for Irene, a process that typically took 6 months compressed into 48 hours of intensive background checks and interviews. The urgency of the situation overrode all standard protocols. Every hour that passed with potential backdoors active in NATO communication systems represented an unacceptable national security risk. While her clearance was being processed, Irene worked with the unclassified portions of the system architecture, developing the framework for her scanning methodology. She worked in a secure conference room adjacent to the main investigation space, her laptop connected to an isolated network that allowed her to analyze code without accessing classified systems directly. Daniel Hartwick arrived at the facility on the second day of the investigation. He'd been summoned by Colonel Brennan for what was diplomatically termed a consultation but was actually an interrogation about his company's security protocols and contractor vetting procedures. Hartwick knew his company's reputation and potentially his freedom hung in the balance. If the investigation determined that his negligence had enabled Chen's espionage operation, the consequences would be catastrophic. He was escorted through the same security checkpoints Irene had passed through, and as he entered the main investigation space, he saw her immediately. She was sitting at a workstation, completely absorbed in the code displayed across 3 monitors, her fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. She looked exactly as she had during the interview, small and unassuming, except now she was surrounded by military officers and intelligence analysts who were watching her work with obvious respect. Brennan approached Hartwick with an expression that made it clear this conversation would not be pleasant. Mr. Hartwick, we need to discuss some serious gaps in your security protocols. Your company certified Robert Chen as trustworthy for work on classified systems. How did your vetting process miss the fact that he'd been compromised? Hartwick felt sweat forming at his collar. Colonel, Chen went through our standard background checks. He had prior military service, excellent references, and no red flags in his financial or personal history. There was no indication that he'd been recruited. Your standard background checks clearly weren't sufficient, Brennan replied coldly. Chen had been making regular unexplained trips to Southeast Asia, had sudden improvements in his financial situation, and had accessed systems far beyond what his assignments required. All of these should have triggered alarm bells. Why didn't they? The truth was that Hartwick's security protocols had been designed to meet the minimum requirements for Pentagon contracts, not to actually catch sophisticated counterintelligence threats. The company had prioritized cost efficiency over thorough vetting, assuming that the government's own security clearance process would catch any major problems. It was a calculated risk that had spectacularly backfired. Before Hartwick could formulate a response that wouldn't incriminate him further, Irene's voice cut through the tension. Colonel Brennan, I think I found something. Everyone in the room turned toward her workstation. Irene pulled up a series of code comparisons on the main display screen. I've been analyzing the backdoor methodology used in Stratcom 7, looking for distinctive patterns that might appear in other systems. The way Chen designed this vulnerability, it has a very specific signature. He used a particular encryption algorithm for the authentication bypass, something that's technically functional but uncommon enough that it stands out if you know what to look for. She pulled up another screen showing network logs from multiple defense contractor systems. I ran a preliminary scan across the unclassified portions of systems Chen had access to, looking for this same encryption signature. I found matches in 7 different networks, all of them handling classified military communications. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. 7 additional backdoors, all potentially active and being exploited by foreign intelligence services. The Stratcom 7 breach wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic compromise of NATO's defense infrastructure. Brennan's face had gone pale. Miss Hill, are you certain about this? I'm certain about the signature matches in the unclassified portions, Irene replied. To confirm they're actually backdoors and not just coincidental code patterns, I'll need access to the full system architecture. That's where the emergency clearance becomes critical. Brennan pulled out his phone and made a call that lasted less than 30 seconds. When he hung up, he looked at Irene with an expression that mixed urgency with something approaching desperation. Your clearance is approved effective immediately. I need you to start the full audit right now. We're potentially looking at the most significant intelligence breach since the Cold War. Over the next 72 hours, Irene worked with an intensity that impressed even the veteran intelligence analysts around her. She barely slept, surviving on coffee and the occasional meal delivered to her workstation. Her emergency security clearance gave her access to technical specifications that most defense contractors never saw, detailed architecture diagrams of communication systems that formed the backbone of Western military operations. The scanning methodology she developed was elegant in its simplicity but devastating in its effectiveness. By identifying Chen's distinctive encryption signature and cross-referencing it with access logs, she could pinpoint exactly where backdoors had been planted and when they'd been activated. Each discovery led to more questions about the scope of the compromise and how long it had been operating undetected. By the third day, Irene had confirmed that all 7 suspected systems contained active backdoors. But what made the situation even more alarming was the sophistication of the implementation. Chen hadn't just planted simple vulnerabilities. He'd created a network of interconnected backdoors that could be activated in sequence, allowing an attacker to move laterally across multiple classified systems while leaving minimal forensic evidence. This is military-grade tradecraft, one of the FBI counterintelligence agents observed as Irene demonstrated how the backdoor network functioned. Chen wasn't working alone. He had training and support from a sophisticated intelligence service. Irene nodded, pulling up communication logs that showed the pattern of data exfiltration. Based on the timing and methodology, I'd estimate he was working with at least 2 other compromised insiders. The backdoors are designed to be accessed in a specific sequence that requires knowledge of multiple systems. One person couldn't effectively exploit all of these vulnerabilities alone. Colonel Brennan looked at the evidence displayed across multiple screens. Miss Hill, I need you to identify potential access points where other insiders might have planted similar vulnerabilities. Can you develop a scanning methodology that works across all Pentagon contractor systems, not just the ones Chen directly accessed? It was an enormous request, expanding Irene's audit from 7 known compromised systems to potentially hundreds of contractor networks. But she understood the necessity. If Chen had colleagues working for the same foreign intelligence service, they would have used similar methodologies. Finding them required scanning the entire defense contractor ecosystem. I can develop the scan, Irene replied. But implementing it across all contractor systems will require cooperation from companies that might not want their security protocols scrutinized. Some of them will resist, especially if they're worried about losing contracts due to security failures. Brennan's expression hardened. Let me worry about contractor cooperation. You focus on developing the most comprehensive security audit the Pentagon has ever conducted. I want every potential vulnerability identified and documented. Daniel Hartwick had been present for most of these briefings, watching as Irene systematically dismantled assumptions about how secure Pentagon contractor systems actually were. Each new discovery was another indictment of the industry's security practices, including his own company's protocols. But what struck him most was how wrong he'd been about capability and expertise. Irene wasn't just technically proficient. She had a strategic understanding of how intelligence operations worked, how nation-states exploited vulnerabilities, and how to think systematically about security in ways that his entire team hadn't managed. Her unconventional background, the thing he'd mocked during the interview, had given her perspectives that conventional defense contractors lacked. During a break in the briefings, Hartwick approached Irene's workstation. She looked up, her expression neutral but cautious. This was the first time they'd directly interacted since the investigation began. Miss Hill, Hartwick began, his voice lacking its usual confidence. I owe you an apology. Not just for how I treated you during the interview, but for my fundamental misunderstanding of what makes someone qualified for this work. You've demonstrated capabilities that I didn't believe existed, let alone in someone with your background. Irene saved her work and turned to face him fully. Mr. Hartwick, I appreciate the apology. But I need you to understand something. This isn't about me proving you wrong. This is about the systematic way people like you dismiss people like me. You looked at my resume and saw someone who didn't fit your preconceptions of what expertise looks like. You never considered that maybe your preconceptions were the problem. Hartwick absorbed her words, feeling the sting of truth in them. You're right. I made assumptions based on credentials and experience metrics that I thought mattered. I was wrong about what actually matters in this field. It's not just this field, Irene continued, her accent becoming slightly more pronounced as emotion entered her voice. It's everywhere. People look at my background, my age, where I'm from, and they decide what I'm capable of before I've said a single word. I've spent years fighting against those assumptions, and honestly, I'm tired of it. What would it take, Hartwick asked carefully, for you to consider working with Hartwick Defense Solutions? Not as a junior analyst or someone we're taking a chance on, but as someone whose expertise we genuinely need and respect. Irene studied him for a long moment. Mr. Hartwick, 48 hours ago, you laughed at my resume. Now you're offering me a position because the Pentagon is forcing you to acknowledge my capabilities. Can you understand why I might be skeptical about the sincerity of that offer? Before Hartwick could respond, Colonel Brennan interrupted. Miss Hill, we've completed the preliminary analysis of your scanning methodology. The Joint Chiefs want a briefing on your findings. They're flying in from locations across the globe for this. That's how serious they're taking your work. The briefing took place in a secure conference room that Irene later learned was typically reserved for discussions of the highest classified matters. The attendees included 4-star generals, intelligence agency directors, and senior Pentagon officials who made decisions affecting global military strategy. Irene was the youngest person in the room by at least 2 decades and the only one without a military rank or official government position. She stood at the front of the room, her laptop connected to the classified presentation system, and walked through her findings with the same calm precision she'd demonstrated throughout the investigation. She explained Chen's methodology, the network of backdoors he'd created, and the broader implications for defense contractor security protocols. The fundamental problem, Irene explained, isn't just that Robert Chen was compromised. It's that our entire approach to contractor security is built on assumptions that sophisticated adversaries have learned to exploit. We assume that background checks and security clearances are sufficient. We assume that compartmentalization prevents lateral movement across systems. We assume that certified secure systems are actually secure. All of those assumptions are wrong. General Patricia Whitmore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, leaned forward. Miss Hill, what you're describing suggests that our entire defense contractor ecosystem is vulnerable. Are you telling us that we need to rebuild our security infrastructure from the ground up? Not entirely, Irene replied. But we need to fundamentally change how we think about security. Instead of relying on credentials and certifications, we need continuous monitoring and verification. Instead of assuming that cleared personnel are trustworthy, we need behavioral analysis and anomaly detection. Instead of compartmentalized security reviews, we need holistic audits that look at how systems interact. That's a massive undertaking, another general observed. The cost and time required would be astronomical. The cost of not doing it is higher, Irene countered. Based on the data exfiltration logs I've analyzed, foreign intelligence services have had access to classified NATO communications for at least 18 months. They know our strategic planning, our troop movements, our alliance coordination. If there had been a military conflict during that period, we would have been operating with completely compromised communications. The tactical disadvantage could have been catastrophic. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. This wasn't just a security breach. It was a strategic vulnerability that had exposed the entire Western defense infrastructure to adversary intelligence collection. After 2 hours of detailed questioning, General Whitmore made a decision. Miss Hill, the Pentagon is establishing a new task force focused on defense contractor security. I want you to lead the technical analysis component. This isn't a consulting position or a temporary assignment. This is a permanent role with full authority to audit any defense contractor system and implement security protocols across the entire ecosystem. Irene felt a rush of emotions: pride, validation, and a sense of responsibility that was almost overwhelming. General Whitmore, I'm honored. But I need to be clear about something. If I accept this role, I won't be diplomatic about contractors who resist security improvements. I won't protect companies that prioritize profits over genuine security. And I won't accept limitations based on what people think I should or shouldn't be capable of understanding. Whitmore smiled slightly. Miss Hill, I'm not offering you this position because I want someone diplomatic. I'm offering it because you've demonstrated that you understand these systems better than anyone else in this room. Your job will be to fix what's broken, regardless of whose feelings get hurt in the process. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The news of Irene's appointment spread quickly through the defense contractor community, generating reactions that ranged from cautious optimism to outright hostility. Many contractors saw her as an outsider who didn't understand the complexities of defense work. Others recognized that her appointment represented a fundamental shift in how the Pentagon would approach security going forward. Daniel Hartwick was among those who understood that the entire industry was about to change. He'd returned to his company's headquarters facing difficult questions from his board of directors and clients who'd heard about the Chen investigation. Hartwick Defense Solutions had been fortunate that Irene's analysis had focused on systemic problems rather than pointing fingers at individual contractors, but everyone knew that more detailed audits were coming. 3 weeks after the Pentagon briefing, Hartwick received the call he'd been expecting and dreading. It was Irene, now officially titled as Technical Director of the Pentagon's Defense Contractor Security Task Force. Her voice was professional but carried an edge that made it clear she hadn't forgotten how their first meeting had ended. Mr. Hartwick, your company is scheduled for a comprehensive security audit beginning next month. This will be the first audit conducted under the new protocols, which means it will be thorough and potentially uncomfortable. I wanted to give you advance notice so you can prepare your team. I appreciate that, Hartwick replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Miss Hill, I know our previous interaction didn't end well. But I want you to know that I've spent the past few weeks reviewing our security protocols, and I've realized how many gaps existed. Not just in technical safeguards, but in our entire culture around security. I'm glad you've come to that realization, Irene said. But understanding the problem and fixing it are two different things. During the audit, my team will be examining every aspect of your operations. Your contractor vetting procedures, your access controls, your monitoring systems, your incident response protocols. Everything. If we find deficiencies, there will be consequences. I understand, Hartwick replied. And Miss Hill, for what it's worth, I genuinely am sorry about the interview. Not just because you proved me wrong, but because my assumptions prevented me from recognizing real capability when it was sitting right in front of me. There was a pause before Irene responded. Mr. Hartwick, I've been dismissed by people like you my entire career. People who looked at my background and decided I wasn't worth their time. What you did wasn't unique. It was just one more example of how the defense industry values pedigree over actual competence. The difference now is that I have the authority to change that. After the call ended, Hartwick sat in his office thinking about how much had changed in just a few weeks. The woman whose resume he'd literally thrown across a conference table was now the person who would determine whether his company kept its Pentagon contracts. The cosmic justice of it was almost poetic. But beyond the personal irony, Hartwick recognized that Irene represented something larger. She was forcing the entire defense contractor industry to confront uncomfortable truths about how security had been treated as a checkbox exercise rather than a genuine priority. Her unconventional background, the thing he'd mocked, had given her perspectives that conventional defense contractors desperately needed. Meanwhile, Irene was building her task force team, deliberately recruiting people whose backgrounds didn't fit traditional defense industry profiles. She hired analysts from Eastern Europe who understood how adversary intelligence services operated. She brought in researchers from academic institutions who'd been studying security vulnerabilities but lacked defense industry connections. She recruited former hackers who'd spent years identifying weaknesses in commercial systems. Her team looked nothing like a typical Pentagon operation. They were young, diverse, unconventional, and they approached security with fresh perspectives that weren't constrained by how things had always been done. Some senior Pentagon officials were skeptical about Irene's hiring choices, but General Whitmore had given her complete authority over team composition, and she was using it to build something genuinely different. 6 weeks after her appointment, Irene's task force completed its first audit of Hartwick Defense Solutions. The findings were damning, documenting dozens of security deficiencies that ranged from inadequate contractor vetting to insufficient monitoring of privileged access. But the report also acknowledged that Hartwick had been more cooperative than expected, implementing preliminary improvements even before the audit was complete. The audit results triggered immediate consequences across the defense contractor industry. The Pentagon announced that all contractors working on classified systems would undergo similar comprehensive reviews within the next 12 months. Companies that failed to meet the new security standards would lose their contracts, regardless of how long they'd been trusted vendors or how politically connected their executives were. For Irene, the following months became a blur of audits, briefings, and confrontations with contractors who resented having their operations scrutinized by someone they considered an outsider. She faced pushback from industry veterans who questioned her authority, from executives who tried to go over her head to their Pentagon contacts, and from lobbyists who argued that the new security protocols were too expensive and burdensome. But General Whitmore had given Irene something rare and valuable, genuine authority backed by unwavering support. Every time a contractor tried to circumvent her requirements or complain to senior Pentagon officials, Whitmore made it clear that Irene's word was final. The message spread quickly. If you wanted to maintain Pentagon contracts, you needed to meet the standards she established. The transformation wasn't just about technical security measures. Irene pushed for fundamental changes in how the defense industry thought about capability and expertise. She advocated for hiring practices that valued demonstrated skills over prestigious credentials, for security cultures that encouraged questioning assumptions rather than following established procedures, and for contractor vetting that looked at behavior patterns rather than just background checks. Some of her most significant battles weren't with defense contractors but with Pentagon bureaucracy itself. She discovered that many of the security deficiencies in contractor systems existed because Pentagon procurement processes incentivized the cheapest compliant bid rather than the most genuinely secure solution. Contractors had been meeting the letter of security requirements while ignoring the spirit, and the Pentagon's own procedures had enabled that behavior. Irene wrote reports that made senior officials uncomfortable, documenting how their own policies had created vulnerabilities. She testified before congressional committees about the need for defense acquisition reform. She gave interviews to security researchers and journalists, building public awareness about issues that had previously been hidden behind classification barriers. Not everyone appreciated her candor. She received criticism from Pentagon officials who thought she was being too aggressive, from contractors who claimed she was destroying their businesses, and from industry groups who lobbied for her removal. But she also received support from an unexpected quarter, junior analysts and engineers across the defense industry who'd spent years knowing that security protocols were inadequate but lacking the authority to change them. Irene became something of a folk hero among younger defense industry professionals who saw her as proof that capability mattered more than pedigree. Her story spread through professional networks and security conferences, inspiring others who'd been dismissed because of their backgrounds to push harder for recognition of their actual skills. 6 months into her tenure, Irene received a message from Daniel Hartwick requesting a meeting. His company had passed its follow-up audit, implementing every security improvement her task force had recommended. But Hartwick wanted to discuss something beyond compliance requirements. They met at a coffee shop in Arlington, neutral territory away from Pentagon offices and corporate headquarters. Hartwick looked different from the confident executive who'd laughed at her resume. He seemed humbled, more thoughtful, as if the past months had fundamentally changed how he understood his own industry. "Miss Hill," he began, "I've spent the past 6 months thinking about what you said during the investigation. About how I dismissed you based on preconceptions rather than evidence. You were right. And the more I've learned about your work, the more I've realized that my company needs exactly the kind of perspective I was too blind to recognize." Irene sipped her coffee, waiting for him to continue. "I'm not here to offer you a job," Hartwick said. "I know you're doing important work at the Pentagon. But I want to ask for your advice about something. I'm trying to change my company's culture, to make it more like what you're building with your task force. But I keep running into resistance from people who think the old ways were fine." Irene considered his question carefully. "Mr. Hartwick, culture change doesn't happen because executives suddenly realize they were wrong. It happens when you change who has power and authority. The people resisting your changes are resisting because the old system benefited them. They got hired, promoted, and rewarded based on credentials and connections rather than actual capability. Of course they don't want that system to change. So what do I do?" Hartwick asked. "Fire everyone who disagrees with the new direction?" "No," Irene replied. "You demonstrate that the new way works better than the old way. You hire people who would have been dismissed under the old system and give them real authority. You promote based on demonstrated results rather than years of experience. You make it clear that the path to success in your company runs through actual competence, not through fitting traditional profiles." Hartwick nodded slowly. "That's essentially what you've done with your task force. Built something that works differently and proved it's better." "Exactly. And the reason it works is because I had the authority to do it properly. General Whitmore didn't just give me a title. She gave me the power to make real changes and the backing to withstand the inevitable pushback. If you want to change your company's culture, you need to be willing to defend the people who represent that change, even when it's uncomfortable." They talked for another hour, with Irene sharing insights about building teams, evaluating capability, and creating environments where unconventional talent could thrive. It was a conversation that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier, when Hartwick had been certain he understood everything about his industry and Irene had been just another dismissed candidate. As they prepared to leave, Hartwick had one final question. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd just accepted my rejection? If you hadn't offered to help when Patricia contacted you about the breach?" Irene smiled slightly. "I think about it sometimes. But the thing is, I didn't help because I wanted to prove you wrong. I helped because there was a problem I could solve and people were in danger. Your opinion of me was never really the point." "That might be the most damning thing you've said," Hartwick replied with a rueful laugh. "That you saved my company and my career, and it wasn't even about me." A year after the Stratcom 7 breach, Irene's task force had audited 43 defense contractors and identified over 200 security vulnerabilities that had been invisible to conventional security reviews. 3 additional compromised insiders had been identified and prosecuted. The Pentagon estimated that her work had prevented intelligence losses that would have cost billions of dollars and potentially thousands of lives in any future conflict. But perhaps more importantly, Irene had changed the conversation about what expertise looked like in the defense industry. Her success had opened doors for others with unconventional backgrounds, creating opportunities for capability-driven careers rather than credential-driven ones. The industry was still far from perfect, but it was moving in a better direction. Irene thought about this evolution one evening as she reviewed audit reports in her Pentagon office. Her phone buzzed with a message from her father in Croatia. He'd finally started to understand what she did for work, though the classified nature of it meant she couldn't share many details. His message was simple: "Your mother and I are proud of you. We always were, but now we understand why this mattered so much to you." She smiled and typed a reply, then returned to her work. Tomorrow she had 3 contractor audits to oversee, a briefing for the Secretary of Defense, and a congressional testimony about defense acquisition reform. The work was demanding, sometimes frustrating, but it was exactly what she'd prepared herself for during all those years when people told her she didn't belong in this field. Irene Hill had proven that the most dangerous vulnerabilities weren't in the code or the networks. They were in the assumptions people made about who was capable of protecting them. And by challenging those assumptions, she'd made everyone safer. The European woman with the emotional demeanor and unconventional resume had become exactly what the Pentagon needed, even if it took them far too long to recognize it. Outside her office window, Washington, D.C. stretched into the evening, the monuments lit against the darkening sky. Somewhere in that city, in conference rooms and secure facilities, other young professionals with unconventional backgrounds were working on problems that others said they couldn't possibly solve. Irene hoped they remembered that capability wasn't about fitting someone else's expectations. It was about being ready when the moment came to prove those expectations wrong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.